Okay, let's learn about watercolor. This is an example of watercolor. We're going to do some exercises to learn how to create your own watercolor picture. I have been soaking markers in water and saving the color that comes off and pouring it into these containers. This is a watercolor we will be using for this project. This is an example of watercolors that I have done, and this kind of shows a variety of how we can use watercolor, different ways and methods we can make different effects with watercolor. To start with, we will work with wet on wet. So this is our watercolor paper, and this is just a practice paper. This is someone else's original that they didn't want to keep. So to do wet on wet, I have a cup of water. I have a watercolor brush, and I am just going to wet the paper. And I am going to go ahead and use one of these trays. Get a container with watercolor on it. Use my eyedropper. Put some color out into this little carton. And I might get oranges next. Use a clean eyedropper. So I've got my paper wet, and I am going to make sure that my brush is wet, and I'm going to put this in the color, and it will expand the color out wherever the water touches the paper. So this is if you want to cover a big area, and you can do this by wetting the paper first. So this is an example of wet on wet. Wet on dry. So I've only painted water on this section. What I'm going to do is get some paint on my brush and just paint a little area that I can do a little bit more detailed work. So this one doesn't expand the paint color out. So that is wet paint on dry paper. My next one is a graduated wash. So I'm going to clean off my brush. And then I am going to wet an area like I did with the yellow. And I'll pick up some orange color on my brush. And I'm just going to bring that color down. And if you notice, it gets a little lighter in color down here as I clean off my brush almost on the paper. So that is a graduated wash. An even wash would be wetting an area on the paper, and then I continually load my brush to make it even. I don't want it to get lighter colored the farther down it gets. So that is my even wash. Dry brush on dry paper. So I'm going to clean off my brush I'm going to dry it really well. And I am just going to pick up the wet paint on a dry brush and put it on a dry paper. This one is a little bit more detailed than the one up here. I can have a little bit more control over where I want my paintbrush and my paint to go. So this just gives me a little bit more control, and this is the dry brush. Blotted, I have this area of an even wash. So what I'm going to do is I can take my paper towel dry and soak up some of it, or blot the paper. Or I can even add a little bit of water to my paper towel, and I can move my paper towel around and make kind of a different effect, light and dark areas. So I am blotting this one. The salt effect, I think I will use blue. Well, that one is black. I think I will use blue. Get a little bit more color. It's almost a blue-violet. I think I will use a larger brush for the salt effect. I want to cover a bigger area. Add some blue to my brush. Well, I guess it's a purple, blue-violet. And then I'm going to take salt. And if you notice, the salt starts soaking up the color. So that one we will have to come back and look at, but it will eventually give it this kind of a texture here. So we'll let the salt dry before we brush it off. Once the paint is dry, we'll brush off the salt and it will look like that. Splatter on wet paper. I'm going to wet down an area on my paper. I'm going to load my brush with color. And if you notice, the water and the paint seem to spread out a little bit, so you don't have as strong of a color. Maybe I might try a little orange. But it does seem to spread out. So that is splatter on wet. Now if we do a splatter on dry, clean off my brush.